Good afternoon. I am David Morgan, president of the Multicultural Media and Correspondents Association, and I want to thank you all for joining us for the third installment of our Racial Reckoning series. As America's persistent challenge in 2023 remains racial inequality and injustice, in today's live discussion, we're going to talk about transformation and healing and the unheralded interfaith that is moving the needle to secure racial justice in America. So it's my privilege to introduce today's moderator, the award-winning and veteran journalist, Adele M. Banks, production editor and national reporter for Religion News Service. Adele joined RNS in 1995 and has covered every facet of news, culture, and history-making events through the lens of religion. Please check out her reporting online, where you can read her stories that span topics from voting rights and gun violence from the perspective of progressive National Baptists to Southern Baptists in the Me Too age. And that's not even scratching the surface. With that, I pass the virtual mic over to you, Adele. Thank you for honoring us as today's moderator.
I introduce you to our esteemed panelists. They are working to increase awareness and galvanize support for civic actions among Christians, Jewish, Sikh, and other communities to actually create the type of change in racial justice and equity that many are calling for to heal a fractured America. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Simranjeet Singh, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Religion and author of the national bestseller, The Light We Give, How Sikh Wisdom Can Transform Your Life, and a columnist for Religion News Service. We have the Reverend Dr. Audrey Price, who is the former Executive Minister for Strategic Operations with the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ, and she is now the Deputy Director at the Aspen Institute's Religion and Society program. So we have colleagues here. Dr. Price is a leader, as I said, in the United Church of Christ, and she teaches a course called Theological Conversations for Dismantling Racism at Wesley Theological Seminary. And last but not least is Rabbi Joshua Stanton of East End Temple in New York City, a Reformed Jewish congregation. He's a published author, co-founder of the Journal of Interreligious Studies, an academic journal that he founded while he was a rabbinical student. And he's currently the Director of Leadership for the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, as well as a contributing writer for Religion News Service. So welcome to you all. The history of racial equity and interfaith cooperation is very much a long one. It was the activism of church-going people involved in politics, coupled with the religious impulses of people of Jewish faith, a multitude of Christian denominations, influences of Gandhi, and others that empowered the civil rights movement in America. And we can't overlook the anti-apartheid movement, which involved people of all faiths who made up a multi-faith committee that included Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, and Sikhs, all working together to increase awareness of the evils of apartheid. So with that, let's talk about what interfaith cooperation really means and what does it look like in America today. We'll cover a wide variety of ideas in just over an hour, and those include what it is about faith traditions that have naturally led religious leaders, people tied to faith traditions, to be drawn to this work of racial justice. We'll examine the hard work of confronting race and racism, inequity, and what it takes to bring people of different backgrounds and across generations together to inspire the changes that finally unravel, it is hoped, some of the deep-seated systemic injustices here in the United States, and how to confront the mindsets that perpetuate the bigotry and white supremacy that permeate aspects of American culture. I know that's a lot, but this group of panelists continues to tackle these issues in the work they do. So we're going to start with Dr. Singh. You have written about how there are many organizations that are at the intersection of faith and policy. How do you explain what it means to work at the intersection of racial equity and interfaith cooperation in the U.S.? What does that look like?
Thank you. Thank you, Del, for that wonderful introduction, and great to be with you and with all of you. As always, good friends, good colleagues. And I would say, in reaction to your question, I would want to offer two kinds of perspectives, one that's more personal and one that's more observational in terms of what I'm seeing in the landscape. The personal one, and I think this might resonate with you, Josh, and you as well, Audrey. Just knowing the two of you, it's a view of the world in which faith and justice are not separated. And for me, in my own tradition, we are taught from a young age and all throughout our lives that to be a faithful person, to be a loving person in this world, is to engage with the world and to help reduce people's suffering. And it's in many ways, it feels like it's that simple. That if you really love, then you will show up for people. I've two young girls, and it's simple enough for them to understand. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate it, and we say, well, we should create these barriers or these arguments for why faith is not something that is social or something that is not active. It's something that's internal or purely spiritual. But in our tradition, the term we use is miri piri, that every individual is expected to be both spiritual and socially engaged. And I think that very much is a part of what real feeling of compassion, this real understanding that our lives are bound up with one another's, is at the core of this work. In the interfaith space, I think the most beautiful manifestations of this come race or religion or so on. And one of the stand-up examples that I've been really inspired by is a group called Shoulder to Shoulder, which is primarily a Christian organization, Christian leadership, whose entire focus is to deal with anti-Muslim bigotry. And I look at that as such a beautiful example of what it means to be selfless, which is a big quality to which we aspire for in my tradition, to understand that the world is not just about you, and even though you and your community might have its own problems, other people have challenges too, and we can really serve them and become better together through this kind of activism. So that's an example that I wanted to share as the kinds of work that I'm seeing in this world that don't actually typically get the attention, but I think have a lot to offer us as a society.
Thank you. Reverend Dr. Price, we see how groups of very different walks of life are coming together to form interfaith groups in a way that Dr. Singh just mentioned. But what are some of the obstacles in bringing groups together, both across faiths, but also within religious groups? Can you speak to some of those challenges, please?
Yeah, certainly. Some of which I've encountered even within my own denomination. What I think makes it a challenge sometimes, and at other times an obstacle, is that faith is part of our identity. And so the core principles and the core values that we hold very dear. And there are some things that there are some differences across faith traditions. There are differences within a particular faith tradition. I'll speak from the Christian perspective. Christianity in and of itself is not monolithic. And the very tenets that were designed to unify us, baptism, communion, and ministry, for example, are the things that we have fought over and divided over, and in some cases, lives have been lost. And so oftentimes when we come to the table ecumenically as Christians or interfaith or multi-faith across traditions, with those core values that we're holding in terms of our religious traditions, faith and reason, then they can become stumbling blocks to actually having a conversation. My encouragement has been for us to really rally around our shared common values and shared common principles. And for me, I think that all faith traditions, and even those who don't adhere to a faith tradition, can at least look at the human dignity of people. And in advancing the human dignity, affirming and respecting that, let's talk from that framework, as opposed to the dividing things that keep us from being unifying. So again, like baptism, Christianity, do we dip? Do we sprinkle? Do we immerse? The whole 9 yards. So that's just an example.
Thank you. Thank you. So Rabbi Stanton, the efforts of working across faiths can also take on a political nature. And with your Center for Learning and Leadership, you focus a lot of work around pluralism and finding common ground. How do you apply this guiding principle while working as closely as you do with, say, Muslim advocacy leaders?
I have the blessing of working with people of a lot of different traditions. And the underlying assumption is we don't agree, and there's still a lot of good that we can do together. And I love the humility inherent to pluralism, that there is a lot of truth in my tradition, and at the same time, I don't have to pretend to have all of the answers. And it's actually a great relief for me as a religious leader. A few concrete examples of ways that I've been blessed to work with Muslim leaders. It started really in a deeper way for me around the 10th anniversary of 9/11, when there was a horrible spike in Islamophobia and the naming in the worst of ways and lambasting of a Muslim community that wanted to create a center to gather downtown. And it was called the Ground Zero Mosque, the Monster Mosque, all kinds of other things. What became very clear for me, and it really sort of hit home at a visceral level, because there have been Jewish communities kept from opening centers to gather, is that when one community is kept from gathering where they want, then none of ours are really safe. And so there was a deep sense of resonance between the immigrant stories of my grandparents and the realities that many Muslim Americans, a larger percentage of whom are first and second and third generation Americans, are experiencing right now. And so the question became, what did I wish people did for my grandparents that they didn't? And what can I do now that might create a fundamentally different circumstance for those who are facing similar bigotry? So the particularity of my tradition calling me to pluralist cause in support of another.
Thank you. We'll go on and ask you another question, Rabbi Stanton. You've said that your approach to a lot of the work you do centers around nuance and complexity at a time of simplicity. Can you talk about the work that you do with other faith leaders, perhaps like Dr. Jackie Lewis, to create change in language, and how you have not shied away from asking difficult questions and ones that make some people uncomfortable, like, are Jews white?
Absolutely. So first of all, the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis has been a mentor for 15 years. And when her church faced crisis due to a fire that consumed its physical space, we were blessed as a matter of friendship, not saving the church, but welcoming the church as they would have done to us into our community. And it has grown into a real partnership of learning and collaboration at a deep level, and opened a number of conversations that might not have been accessible otherwise. And one of the recurrent tropes that I think is often unhelpful in the American landscape right now is whether or not Ashkenazi Jews are white. And the underlying conceit in and of itself buys into existing racial frameworks that are deeply problematic. What is the question behind the question? What does it matter to different groups whether Ashkenazi Jews are white or not? And implied within the question is that there isn't actually enough room for everybody in all of their uniqueness, in all of their multidimensional existence. And so we have to delimit the humanity of other people based on characteristics that we are going to foist upon them. And so what I have loved about dialogue with the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis is that we're able to ask 2 or 3 questions beyond the initial question. What is motivating the question? What's at stake for people in the question? What would happen if Jews of
We
of
lost
European ancestry are deemed white in the American racial caste system? And what would it mean if we are not? And so that's what I've been blessed to do with the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. And suffice it to say, I don't have simple answers, but it has been an incredibly enriching dialogue.
Thank you very much for that example. Dr. Singh, you've hosted a series on RNS called Becoming Less Racist, Lighting the Path to Anti-Racism, and write extensively about the intersection of race and religion. Can you talk about the view that is popularly held among people that religion has been weaponized to uphold America's racism? And I invite the others panelists to respond as well after Dr. Singh does.
Yeah, thank you, Del. I appreciate the question, and I'll say there are three ways in which I would want to. This is I understand this is how a professor would answer the question. I have three answers to your one question, but there are three ways in which I would want to call attention to the role that religion has played in producing and perpetuating American racism. And as I learned these, it was actually quite illuminating. Even as someone who experienced racism, I didn't intellectually understand it because we don't talk about the history or the process and the mechanism for what racism looks like, especially in relation to religion. So the first that I would call attention to is the role that religion has played in producing the logic of racism in America. An early starting point that people can look to is the doctrine of discovery, which was a papal bull. So coming out of the church in the 1400s, late 1400s, actually just around the time that Columbus arrived in the Americas. And it essentially gave consent to the colonizers to say, if people are not Christian, you look down on them, you try to convert them, and you have every right to take the land from them. And so this production of a hierarchical understanding of who is superior and who is inferior is at the basis of what American racism has become. And I think that's, again, it's a history that I wasn't taught in school, not even in college, not even in grad school. Where I did a PhD in religion. These are not histories that we are typically familiar with. And so I think it's really important for us to start becoming familiar with these realities to understand how we've come to where we are today. A second piece, as you sort of inferred in your question, Adele, is the ways in which religion has been used to justify racism. And I mean, all of us know that in all sorts of ways, people have used religion and religious ideas to justify all sorts of nasty things in the world. Terrorism, violence against humans, torture. I mean, we see the worst of humanity sometimes is upheld by religious claims, and the same is true in American racism. And where I really started to first learn about this was in understanding the history of slavery and abolition, and seeing the same text, the Bible, was being used to make arguments for the freedom of Black people in this country, and the same text was being used to justify the enslavement of Black people in this country. And that understanding that it's actually not about the text itself, but about the people who interpret it and what they're trying to accomplish through their interpretations really opened my eyes to understanding that it's a choice that we make in how we decide to engage religion. And then the third, and this is the one that is most personal for me and that I felt most directly, is understanding and experiencing the ways that religion and religious identity is racialized. So as somebody who is practicing a tradition that is a minority religion in this country, whose appearance includes a turban and a beard, I've been on the receiving end of people's racism because of what they assume about me. You know, that I'm a terrorist, or that I'm homophobic, or that I'm anti-American, or whatever their assumptions are. And so those experiences over time, I came to understand, is nothing more than racialized understandings of religious identity. And I think if we can start to see how that plays out, we can get to another layer of the relationship between racism and religion in this country.
Would either of the other two panelists want to weigh in about this notion that some have about the weaponization of religion?
Simran, I think, covered the entire landscape. And some resist the urge. He said, our professor would answer with 3 points, a preacher would answer with a 3-point sermon. But I do want to emphasize that religion, or the interpretation and the practice thereof, I don't think religion in and of itself is what upholds America's racism, but the practice of it. And it started even before America became colonized. It is our misinterpretation of, again, speaking from the Christian perspective, of text, both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And so one of the ways, like for instance, in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, where, Christians, and I am a faithful Christian, but will hold firm to this text about, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No other person comes to the Father, they mean God, but through me, Jesus Christ. And unfortunately, then people have interpreted that to believe that Christianity is the only way in which people should practice their religious tradition and therefore be divine, and all others then are heretical and evil, and goes to what Simran is saying. So someone from a different tradition, one who may wear a turban, automatically now becomes racialized and be labeled as a terrorist. The other thing is in the ways in which religion was used and the cultural production of race, even in America. This whole construction of race, starting with the doctrine of discovery, but the whole construction of race was built so that other people can be othered. If you weren't of European descent, you were to be othered. And not only othered, but actually determined as not even being human. And so when you went through the enslavement time and people were being converted to Christianity, which would then give them freedom and liberty, it was determined that people of African descent didn't even have souls because they weren't human. And therefore, slaveholders were justified in the inhumane treatment that was happening because this was property and not humans. We have, as an American institution, built upon that misinterpretation, that co-option of scripture in order to entrench hate.
Thank you. Would you want to add anything, Rabbi Stanton, before we move on?
Yeah, one of the topics that I think we're going to talk about is allyship. And what I see in my own community that frustrates me is a self-satisfaction. On the one hand, we should be happy with ourselves. Why would we be part of a community that we're not happy with? On the other hand, it's almost like we're tokenizing ourselves, that there were some key Jewish leaders who stood for racial justice and understood our texts to be a call for action and solidarity with communities that were being marginalized. And on the other hand, during the civil rights movement and at other key times, the majority of American Jews were passive, just like the majority of Americans were often seen as passive, if not worse, standing for the status quo that was unjust. And there is such a temptation to elevate Abraham Joshua Heschel, to elevate Maurice Eisendrath, to elevate other larger-than-life heroes who were Jewish in the civil rights movement, pat ourselves on the back and say our work is done. And so what I see as an impediment is too much self-congratulatory behavior and not enough self-critique. Once again, I wouldn't be Jewish if I didn't think it were a great way to be. And I didn't think it called me to do something more than accept the status quo. And at the same time, if I think we've already said and done the important things that we possibly can as Jews in the world, similarly, why be Jewish? There is so much work left to do.
Thank you very much. The religious and social experiences of young adults in America today are very different than previous generations. And while the decline in religious affiliation is amongst millennials and now Gen Zers, it's growing. Their role in advocating for and advancing racial and social justice is significant. So, Dr. Price, how would you describe the role young people who are college age and recently out in the world play in the work that we're talking about in creating and growing social justice movements that lead to societal transformation? How intergenerational does the effort need to be to make change?
Yeah, I'm gonna start with your first question. I think it's absolutely essential that we have young people engaged. And the reason why I'm comfortable in saying that is history has proven that out. So most major movements that have happened in the United States gained its legs and its steam once young people were involved. Let's revisit the civil rights movement. There was a lot of work and a lot of push, and there were great leaders who were the voice and the face of that. Not until you had SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that organized the sit-ins at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro. Not until you had John Lewis was 25 when he marched with King across the Selma Bridge, which also was a multi-faith, interfaith thing that happened. We look at that in terms of people of African descent, but we weren't the ones just leading that. It was because it was interfaith and multi-faith. But John Lewis was 25 in doing that. It was not until, unfortunately, the horrendous death of Emmett Till and the bombing of those young girls in Birmingham, to include the one that survived, that America and governmental authorities start to pay attention and the movement start to advance. And eventually we got the first iteration of a bill passed. And so young people, young adults have always been in the throes of that. And not only with racism, but all the other isms. So when we talk about heterosexism, again, it was young people who have opened our eyes to being more affirming to same gender loving people, as well as, again, the equity around women's rights. So it's absolutely essential. And the thing that I resist is when people say it's important because they are the leaders or the future of tomorrow. No, they are the ones that are owning and helping and working in today and will suffer the longest.
Thank you. That leads us to want to share a video that helps speak to the young people in our midst. This summer's MMCA summer interns were engaged in its narrative change program, and they took to Capitol Hill to speak with cohorts who were legislative interns this summer to hear what they think needs changing in America. Here's some of what they heard.
What type of changes in racial justice would you like to see?
I think the number one right now will be the criminal justice system and also probably voting rights as well. Voting impacts our society more than we ever know it, and I don't think some people really truly realize the extent of which it impacts our society.
I think we definitely need to look at our education system now more than ever, whether it's changing courses, whether it's looking at curriculums, whether it's implementing those conversations to be had in school so that when students get to college or to trade school or to their next step in life, we all have a deeper understanding of what equality means and what being a true American means.
Because there's just so much that could be changed. A popular topic for me has to be restorative justice. So instead of like suspending a child, you would, put them in like a peer, or like, let's say the student, they were fighting with another student. They would have like one-on-one conversations with that student instead of, putting them out of school. They would talk it through, figure out a resolution, and then they go back to class.
I believe we need even more representation in positions of power. I believe in Congress, as well as state politics. We need more people of color, of diverse backgrounds, such as LGBTQ plus communities, as well as disabled citizens. So I think we need more representation.
I think it just needs to be an effort of unity and people like really seeing that representation, people that look like themselves.
It's the same things we've been fighting for in 2023. You might have thought things changed 3 years ago. They really haven't.
These simple ideas that we've totally butchered are still unresolved. And to me, I mean, it made me reflect as a parent and as a person on the gap between the aspiration and where we are. and that's what I'm hearing in these young people's voices as well. And it's hard. I think it's hard for me to put into words, but there is a blend of frustration and clear-eyed understanding, and also it's almost like a confusion. Like, we should be there, we know we should be there, we want to be there, why are we not there? And you know, that's in that conversation with my 4-year-old, that's what was in my head, like what I want for her, but also listening to these young people. Like, I think for many of us who work in this space and who experience these kinds of issues, especially around racism, it's hard to rationalize. Maybe that's the point, that it is, we know it shouldn't be this way, and yet it is, and it can feel very disempowering to be sitting here and say, I want to change this, I want to fix it, and to know that there's so much you're up against in order to create that change. So that's my very honest reflection on watching those videos.
Thank you. So, Rabbi Stanton, do you have any reaction to what you heard from the youth?
I perceived a sense of frustration that was well warranted, and very much to what Dr. Singh said. You know, why have we not made more progress, and why are we still fighting the same issues that our parents and grandparents fought for? And I think that it is well placed, and at the same time, my impression in so many things is that actually finishing the work is the last piece of that. The going from ideals to practice can be a lot more complicated than any of us could possibly have imagined at the outset. So I think the frustration is well placed.
When we look back in modern history, the civil rights movement in America was at the confluence of the demand for social justice and the church. But the interfaith effort that strengthened the movement went far beyond Christian denominations. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957 following the Montgomery bus boycott. And the current president and CEO of the organization, Dr. Charles Steele Jr., wanted to share his thoughts on the state of social change and the work of interfaith movements with us today. So let's play the message he recorded.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm honored to just share a few moments in terms of the perspective of SCLC and the problems that we have basically economically, racially, financially, even religiously, in terms of an issue that most people don't want to talk about. And that's racism. And Attorney Kevin Kilmer, who invited me to share a few moments with you as I very successfully convey my message throughout the world. I just got in from Israel a few days ago, on my way to New York area in terms of the East Coast, including Bridgeport, Connecticut. But I wanted to just stop for a moment and just say racism has nothing to do with the pigmentation of your skin. It has everything to do with excluding the unwanted and bringing about the power and control and money in terms of the institution of racism. America is a racist country, and it refused to admit the historicity from which we have come. Let's just start with the transatlantic African slave trade. Ladies and gentlemen, you must know your history. And while there are forces in America in terms of not just elected officials from the conservative mechanism of any particular group, but America itself, including those who are elected and people of color, we need to fight for the historicity from which we have come, from the Negroid race. Yes, I said it, ladies and gentlemen. We are of the Negroid race. The Negroid race, the Caucasoid race, the Mongoloid, Australoid, and now the Island Pacific is considered in terms of the ethnicity and background of race. But we are of the Negroid race, and we are prejudiced toward in terms of racism. It's a difference between being prejudiced and discrimination in terms of racism versus those two elements. Racism also have some people of color involved with it because this system has allowed for some people to be included so they can fight the majority of black folks and people of color. Racism is about who gonna get the money. Matter of fact, politics is all about who gonna get the money. We as African Americans, you'll see a lot of research information, but it's all about the economics, the resources. Let's break it down, the money. That's what racism is all about, and controlling those who are without the financial backing or competing. You live in a capitalistic society and you have no capital. Ladies and gentlemen, did you hear what I just said? You live in a capitalistic society and you have no capital, no access to capital. You go to the bank of today. Even many years ago, a few years ago, I can recall, you could get a loan on your signature because of the banking mechanism of the general manager of the bank. The general manager of the bank nowadays very conservatively has no power. Has no power. You have to be approved for a loan through an underwriter, somebody you don't know, somebody you would never know, and there's no relationship. Bringing about success in society is building relationship. So what has the banking industry done? They have eliminated us to have any type of relationship with a manager of a bank. A manager of a bank is just a prototype of what this system is all about, to exclude the unwanted, to eliminate you from having money. Let me tell you a story that most people don't know. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, killed, murdered for two reasons. One, in his opposition of the Vietnam War. Number two was the fact that he forgot about the economics. The economics. He went and had a conversation with Harry Belafonte just prior to his assassination, 2.5, 3 months prior to. He said, Harry, I'm afraid I've led my people into a burning house. Harry Belafonte said, what are you talking about, Martin? A burning house? He said, I integrated my people into a burning house. I thought integration and the right to vote and putting the right folks in office, and particularly people of color in office, would give us the economics. But I was wrong. We have to be the firemen. He said, what that include, Martin? He said, that include that we must bring about economic development. That's when Dr. King cried for the first time in Marks, Mississippi, on Cotton Street. In Marks, Mississippi, he cried when he saw the impoverishment of African Americans, Negroes at the time, in terms of the lack of economics, the lack of a quality of life. When it rains, the African American and Negro community, we have to get in canoes to get around. In canoes. Couldn't walk, didn't have no cars, no infrastructure in terms of the drainage and the sewage. All of the waste matter went into the streets, which accumulated and brought about diseases. So Dr. King said, we're going to march and demand the check. We're going to Washington, D.C. We're going to the capital of Washington, D.C., and we're going to demand the check. And the check came back, insufficient funds. Ladies and gentlemen, he was taken out. I ain't getting into who took him out. You read between the lines. Dr. King was assassinated right after he orchestrated and organized the Poor People Campaign, which was going to demand that we have a redistribution, not a distribution, redistribution of the wealth. He said America is too rich to allow this type of povertiness within the black and urban communities, as well as the rural community. Ladies and gentlemen, racism has raised its ugly head and is never gone any place. You must realize now that we have lost protection from the federal government. Let me close with this. It was June 25th, 2013, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I was there with 50 other people holding up the sign, "Don't gut Section 4 and Section 5. And what is so ridiculously hurting is that many of our people, African-American people at large, don't know that we're going back to Jim Crow. We're going back to state rights. And people don't realize that. They'll say, I got a black mayor in my city, a majority black city council. That doesn't mean anything because they are under state rights, state control. And my grandmama and mom and parents always told me that the state government was the enemy. And Dr. King said, in flirting with this system, he said that the government is the enemy. They do not want to be fair in terms of eradicating, removing racism from our society. Thank you so much. Hope you benefited from a few things that I said, but guess what? Love is what love does. And this system needs to show us that they love us. God bless you.
There's a lot to unpack from Dr. Steele's message there. But there are some themes there that I'd want to ask about, in particular, economic disparities that he talked about still persisting. Dr. Steele said, quote, "The problems that we have basically are financially, even religiously, the things that people don't talk about, and that's racism." What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I do think that racism has an economic component to it. And so when I was serving formerly in the Southern New England Conference, we looked at economic justice. In fact, when we would look at systemic injustices, we had to look at environmental injustice and economic injustice. Emily Towns wrote a book, it's a little dated now, in 2006, called Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. And she deals with this quite well. When she looks at the whole notion, again, about race being a cultural production of evil, but how it plays out systemically across our healthcare, across our educational system, voting rights. And our latest example, unfortunately, of this was the pandemic. Who suffered the worst? People from marginalized communities. Why did they suffer worse? It's not because they don't take care of themselves. It's because they have less access to adequate health care. And so therefore, they suffer more. Aspen Ideas Festival had a workshop with Katie Couric, a famous tennis star and a known oncologist, to talk about cancer, particularly plaguing women, but all humans. And at that same time, the decision had come down from the Supreme Court about what was it? The lawsuit about affirmative action. And so one of the things that we were talking about, how things that seem to not be connected, with Dr. Steele, I think, was getting at, how they're connected. So women of color, we're not just talking about women of African descent, but women of color, period, suffer more from various forms of cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer. And when I say suffer from, not just being diagnosed, but actually dying from. So cancer is an equal opportunity offender, unfortunately, but women of color tend to die at alarming rates over against women of European descent. And one of the things, why is that? Because there are not enough studies to help to provide preventative care. Then there's not enough access. So there are clinical studies that provide genetic testing, or when people have a diagnosis and need more of a rigorous treatment, women of color are not even invited, not even informed that those exist. So how do I go back to the Supreme Court decision? With the affirmative action, we're limiting then the access of doctors of color, who then have more of an informed lens when they're treating people that are not of European descent. So economics is a huge factor that plays out racism and how we keep racism systemically entrenched. And I can talk about that across the educational system and eating systems and all other systems.
Thank you. Thank you for connecting those dots there. Rabbi Stanton, Dr. Steele also said that racism has nothing to do with the pigmentation of your skin, and instead has everything to do with excluding the unwanted and bragging about the power and control and money in terms of the institutional racism. You have done a lot of work around coalition building and confronting identity and race. Beyond what you had said earlier, what are your thoughts on that challenge?
Dr. Clem Price, who is university professor at Rutgers, brilliantly said that whiteness changes whenever it's convenient for those in power. And so the definitions shift under your feet when all of a sudden it becomes expedient. And there has been this really painful reality that certain Jews, and not all Jews, I would add, but Jews who are white passing of Ashkenazi ancestry are given a purportedly golden ticket. You can get out of being seen as not white. All you have to do is assimilate and lose your identity. And it is a terrible, terrible way out. And at the same time is one of the realities that my community is grappling with on multiple levels. And one of the things that is changing is a refusal to accept that ticket out, both because of what it costs us in terms of identity and values and sense of well-being, and because of what we know it to cost many other people. So part of what's going on in terms of are Jews white is increasingly Jews are saying, we will not accept that question. Our answer is no, because we're being told that we can be white if we give up core tenets of who we are and what we care about and how we relate to other communities. And from the standpoint of the American Jewish community, that is changing the way that we behave in coalition. And it is forcing us to reckon with internal racism, because it's like we woke up and realized that, oh my goodness, 15% of American Jews are not even white passing. And that number is growing rapidly. And so racism that once was seen as out there, it's not about being in solidarity with others, it's about caring for our own. And so there's some big fundamental changes taking place, because all of a sudden it's almost like the powers that be giving us the opportunity to be white in American society are not giving us something that we are willing to accept, certainly not wholesale, and certainly not when it inherently creates otherness for so many people inside our communities and inside our doors.
Thank you. So moving ahead, Dr. Singh, what is the mainstream media getting right, and what are they getting wrong in coverage of religion and the role of interfaith communities when the news of the day is social justice?
If the question is about mainstream media, I would say typically, and this is what a lot of our research is starting to show as well, religion is typically left out of the headlines and the standard stories that we tell about what's happening in our country, unless there's something negative, violent, harmful. What I think we're missing, at least from a mainstream perspective, and I think this also then filters down to our cultural consciousness, is an understanding of what is actually happening in local communities that is positive, that's building bridges across difference, that's really showing us the way we want to be as people. And I think, I understand this, and I know you understand this too, Adele, given the world that you work in and your long experience and portfolio. Unfortunately, our culture is such that, and our news media in the mainstream is such that those kinds of stories that tell us the reality of what people's lives are like on a day-to-day basis are not the ones that get the attention. And so we don't hear them, we're not aware of them, and our understanding, not just of what our country looks like, but even what religion can do, the positive impact it can have in people's lives and in producing social cohesion. It's not a story that many of us are hearing about on a day-to-day basis, even those of us who are looking for those stories. And so I think that's a challenge that many of us have been aware of for a long time, but it feels very difficult to figure out how to crack that code and make sure that those stories come to consciousness in a way that helps to change the culture.
Thank you. So we're ready for another video. When we pose the question about their thoughts on media coverage of the role interfaith movements are having on the social and racial justice issues they are so passionate about, this is what these media savvy Gen Z interns had to say.
How would you feel if I were to tell you that there are religious groups and religious organizations moving towards achieving racial justice and equality in America?
I believe the media is not doing enough to show the intersection between these religious groups. I believe that we're more powerful together and that we're intentionally being divided so that we can make less progress.
The fact that this is my first time being aware of it, like I always say, there's a lot of work that can still be done as far as just with spreading awareness and really controlling the narrative. It kind of allows you to see that because this isn't something that's a predominant topic that's being spread through media, it's definitely something that needs to be pushed forward. And like I said, it just shows that there's still a lot more work that needs to be done.
Everybody should know about these social justice issues, and everybody should know who's fighting for these social justice issues as well. It doesn't matter if you're Black, white, Christian, Muslim, if you're Jewish. This does not matter, because at the end of the day, diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that we all must strive for.
I don't think Black people should be the only people advocating for Black rights. I think that it has to be a joint effort between religious groups, non-Black people, because at the end of the day, when they take rights away from one group, they're going to see how far they can get to take it away from the next group.
Dr. Price, I'm wondering about how you react to what was said in this video, some of which we were able to hear. For instance, there was one young lady who was concerned about the role of women, Black women in particular, being given recognition for the roles they have in leading movements and affecting changes in social justice, policy, and religious leadership.
Yeah. So I think that this video is spot on. When I first saw it, I saw it before today. What I appreciate about it is they're absolutely right that first of all, it's sad that people are not aware of the work that is being done. And that's on us, the practitioners of the work, to make sure that people are aware. And it's one of the things that the Religion and Society program is leaning in quite heavily. We have a racial justice and religion initiative that is religiously pluralistic. The composition of our collective has people from the Unitarian Universalist community, the Sikh community, Baha'i, Muslim, Jewish, those who don't adhere to or a faith tradition, but are thought leaders, and then Christians. And what we are seeking to do is we brought these leaders together who are doing the work in their respective communities, but we're going to now elevate that work, put that on a more of a public platform. More awareness, because there is strength in numbers and there's strength in awareness. So work is being done at the local level, at the communal level, even at the state levels, but we need to elevate and we need to expand that work. And so they're absolutely correct around that. And the sad part, being a woman of African descent, in this work, when I heard them talk about we need to be more aware or have more of a platform for the Black women who are doing this work. Again, it's being done. We need to put more visual around that. And I think that's one of the ways in which the media has been complicit in not helping and can really help us. Reverend Jackie Lewis is doing amazing work, and social media, she's out there. But where's that on the national stage? Reverend Tracy Blackman, when Charlottesville happened, when Ferguson happened, she was on a national platform. She's continued that work, but now that has been in backgrounded. And there are other leaders that are out doing the work. We then, I think, need media to help shine a light on the positive work that is being done in ways that are not re-victimizing the community that we are serving in this work. And as that is lifted up, I think the work becomes more expansive. I think the voice of injustice and hate then becomes lower and eventually gets quelled. But unfortunately, what gets put on the stage, and what more so than not, is the hurt and the hate. And that is the most disadvantage to us making progress in this movement.
Rabbi Stanton, I wondered if you would weigh in, including about the quote that people might have seen at the end of the video. I wonder how you respond to some of these thoughts that both Dr. Price and these students have talked about.
So I love that Elie Wiesel quoted a pastor. And in this case, you would say in Hebrew, B'Shem Omro, it is actually in someone else's words that Elie Wiesel quoted. And it's Pastor Martin Niemöller, who, as it turns out, was my grandfather's pastor. My grandfather was biologically Jewish enough that he lost a huge number of relatives in World War II and had to flee for his own safety. But in order to make it in German society, his parents and him in turn had converted to Christianity. And so there is a remarkable resonance personally with Martin Niemöller. My grandfather received his first Bible from him, and his orientation to religion came very largely from this justice-focused coalition-building pastor in Germany. And so what I love about what Dr. Price described is sort of the religious inspiration for justice work and how we get it center stage. And I don't have many answers. I do not pretend to be an expert, but if there's one thing I do know from my family history and from Pastor Niemöller, it's that it became center stage after the fact. At the time, it was important for a lot of individuals. After the fact, it was instructive for generations yet to come. And so what I wonder in terms of the staying power of religion is, what is going to be instructive in 25 years from now? What are we going to take as heritage to pass on to our kids and their kids? What will be seen as mainstream? And Pastor Niemöller is today in the United States more than he was at the time he wrote this poem in Germany.
All right, thank you very much. Now, when the interns were asked who they picture as the leaders of the movements and campaigns advancing the causes for racial equity, here were some of their answers.
When you think about the fight for racial equality in America, who do you picture leading that movement?
So the first picture I think of somebody young. I think of young people, especially nowadays, as leading the fight for change, but more specifically Black women. I think historically, when you look at big movements such as Black Lives Matter movement, the LGBTQ plus movements, and the women's rights movements, Black women have been at the forefront of those movements and aren't often recognized.
It is us who are going to inherit the problems that are faced when we grow up. I mean, these problems aren't new. And they're going to be here after we are old, and it's time for our children to rise up and do it.
I see everyone as their own activist. I think that compared to the civil rights movement, they were pioneers, kind of leaders of the movement. Whereas I think now, especially in the era of Gen Z, almost all of us are in ways social leaders in our own communities or on social media or in our schools.
I believe the real leaders of change, especially when it comes to racial and inequality change, it comes from people our age. It comes from the people on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter, who are building up these big campaigns, these big petitions, just bringing out and bringing more awareness to these social issues that are affecting our racial groups in this country.
But we're definitely getting a lot more diversity in terms of people coming to join the fight and being allies to the cause.
Honestly, I had an idea, but it's kind of refreshing to hear that, to know that we're all in the struggle together for equality for all, because that's what America was supposed to be built on, equality for all.
Then I think let's start with Dr. Singh as to how you react to what these folks have had to say, whether you have a different answer maybe to the questions that relate to who's leading that movement now for the fight for racial equality, maybe names we don't always hear.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I think so much of what they said resonates for me in terms of what we're seeing, how we're growing, where we're going from here. The other piece of it that I'm really that I see shifting in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime is the racial composition of people who are committed to fighting racism is becoming more and more diverse. And that's something that I'm excited about. I'm really appreciative of. I mean, it's about time. But people understanding that you don't have to be Black to care about anti-Blackness. You don't have to be Jewish to care about anti-Semitism. I mean, again, it shouldn't be so hard to wrap our heads around that. But I think what's really happening is people are starting to feel it, and that's, I think, a radical shift that I'm really excited about.
Just simply that let's gather those up that are excited. I mean, absolutely. I affirm what they say. That has always been the case. And I like the fact that there's a generation that feel empowered. And so let's gather them up and let's move forward.
All right, thank you. We are getting close to the end, not quite there yet, but one of the things that we wanted to ask is to circle back about the topic of allyship. And I think some of you have given some examples of that, but I wonder if you have any personal example for either how you have been an ally in this area or how someone, perhaps surprisingly, has been an ally of yours.
I can give one that comes to mind immediately, and that's with Josh here. We were at a UN event a couple of months ago or so, and I was having issues getting through security, as happens, and Josh insisted on staying with me until I got through. And it's not like him being there made the process go any more quickly, or it wouldn't have made a difference with him being there whether I got through or not. But just the fact that he was willing to stay with me and hang out. I mean, it helps that we're friends and we had fun hanging out, but also, him making a pointed statement to the security guard saying, I'm not going unless he goes. It meant nothing to them probably, but it meant a lot to me. So it was really meaningful.
I view it as friendship, and I view it as sort of what you do for your friends. And thinking if I had gone through security with a friend of any number of backgrounds and they had been stopped, I would never think of going on. And so maybe allyship is friendship that persists and is filled with love, even at moments when the particularities of your friend are being identified for unfortunate reasons. And I view the same when people are allies with me. After the massacre at the Pittsburgh synagogue, the Tree of Life synagogue, a handful of years ago, the number of people who reached out and just said, what do you need to feel safe going to synagogue again? And to them, they were going to walk with me to make sure that I felt okay going to synagogue. And that's what they were going to do as friends, understanding that my particularities were giving me a certain vulnerability at that moment. So it is friendship with keen awareness of particularities that might make someone vulnerable at a time.
Thank you. We're going to show one more short video for your consumption here now.
Is there a way to get young people and religious leaders working together to create change?
If you won't bring the young people to church, then bring church to them, right? Or just be in the spaces that young people are. Young people don't necessarily have to always come into these religious spaces. You can come to us, right? So that young people are in school, go to their school. That young people are in the library sometimes, go to the library. Sometimes you even know that they're at the club. I mean, you could just have general conversations slotted in there, right? So if you're able to engage them, find ways to engage them, figure out what are the best ways to get them involved, I promise it'll work.
Listening is a key skill that from Gen Z and from the older generations can take from, right? From my generation, we need to sit down and listen to what our elders have told us and what they've experienced, but also our elders have to also listen to the different perspectives that the Generation Z has, because that's how you can close that gap.
had to scoot, but he so appreciated having a chance to be with us and share his thoughts. I'd like to ask our remaining panelists if they have any quick reaction to what they just heard from the young people talking about, some of the next steps, how to work together.
I agree with them. And one of the things I don't want to do is explain them what they've said, because I think that their words can stand alone. They're absolutely right. The key thing that they said is we have to listen to each other. That's across generations, that's across religious traditions, that's across humanity.
Rabbi Josh Stanton, did you have any comment on that?
I wholeheartedly agree. What I kept wondering about was the context for all of those comments. I was sort of nodding to myself like, yeah, everything they're saying is right. And every comment is rooted in context. I wish I knew the context.
Thank you. So I want to ask one final question of you, and that is, despite all the challenges that we've discussed here today, what gives you the most hope that people across faiths and generations can work together?
We've done it before. Hope comes from history. Look, the Jewish people is close to 4,000 years old. And what that gives us is a sense of context, a sense of rootedness, a sense of how bad things can be and how good things can be. And because there is precedent for thousands of years working together across lines of difference, we can do it again. And the key question is, what makes for the circumstances in which we will? That is our task to study.
Dr. Price?
Amen. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I want to thank you all the panelists, for your time and your thoughtful conversation today. And I want to let anyone who listens now or later to this recording to know that there will be a way to also get to the videos. They will be available afterwards on the platform of the Multicultural Media and Correspondents Association. We hope that you will follow, subscribe, and share today's live discussion on the BIPOC Exchange. And on behalf of the MMCA, I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you again.